Chapter 2: The Geography of Early Trade. To understand the history of black pepper, one must first understand the shape of the earth. A single peppercorn is a small, hard, wrinkled sphere, utterly unimpressive to the naked eye. Yet for this tiny berry, towering mountain ranges were scaled, vast oceans were mapped, and empires were systematically drained of their gold. The physical weight of pepper is negligible, but its geographical gravity is immense. In the ancient world, geography was not a passive backdrop to human events. Topography, wind, and water were active characters, constantly dictating human economics and forcing merchants to adapt or perish. The earth did not yield its treasures easily, and it actively repelled human intrusion at every turn. To move a sack of pepper from the vines of India to a dining table in Rome was to declare war on the physical environment. This was not a globalized world of frictionless trade. It was a world of severe topographical constraints, brutal meteorological cycles, and treacherous maritime routes. Early global commerce was fundamentally a battle against friction, where every mile traversed required an immense expenditure of human and animal energy. The story of the early pepper trade is the story of how human beings learned to navigate, bypass, and eventually harness the geological and atmospheric forces of the planet.
To trace the path of ancient pepper is to map the physical contours of the ancient world. It reveals a narrative defined by human endurance, forced by the uncompromising will of the Earth's surface.
Topographical constraints. Overcoming the terrain. The cradle of Piper Nigrum lies on the Malabar coast, a narrow strip of land pinned against the southwestern edge of the Indian subcontinent. Geographically, this western coastal belt is relatively flat compared to the eastern highlands. It is crisscrossed by a complex network of interconnected brackish canals, lakes, estuaries, and rivers, known collectively as the Kerala backwaters. This waterlogged environment, steeped in heavy humidity and dense tropical heat, provided the perfect incubator for the climbing pepper vine. However, the very conditions that allowed the spice to thrive made it uniquely difficult to extract. Directly east of this fertile coastal plain rises the Sahyadri mountain range, known more commonly as the Western Ghats. The Western Ghats act as a geographical bottleneck, a towering wall of basalt and dense jungle that forces trade into narrow, highly specific corridors. Rising to elevations exceeding 2,000 meters, these mountains separate the coastal plains from the dry, elevated expanse of the Deccan Plateau. For ancient merchants attempting to move bulk agricultural goods overland, the Ghats were a formidable, almost insurmountable geological barrier. The jungle covering these mountains was a hostile, aggressively overgrown environment. The steep slopes were choked with arborescent flora, towering teak and sandalwood trees, and impenetrable bamboo thickets. The ground was perpetually slick with mud, teeming with leeches, and completely unsuitable for wheeled transport during the heavy monsoon rains. Harvesting the pepper meant navigating this vertical, slippery terrain on foot. Laborers had to pluck the green berries from climbing vines that wrapped themselves around the massive trunks of the forest trees. Once harvested and dried in the sun, the resulting black pepper had to be moved out of the highlands. Because the jungle paths were too steep and treacherous for large convoys, the initial movement of goods was agonizingly slow. Spices grown in the forested hills traveled by foot and by bullock cart down narrow, dangerous tracks. They were eventually funneled toward the rivers, where the burden of transport was transferred to local boats. These enchanting traditional vessels were crafted meticulously from local Angili wood and bamboo. These river routes allowed the pepper to bypass the worst of the jungle mud, floating down into the estuarine labyrinth of the Malabar coast. But even upon reaching the coast, moving the pepper eastward across the subcontinent required navigating the massive wall of the Ghats. Early trade would have been severely stunted if not for a single miraculous geological anomaly. This anomaly is the Palakkad Gap, also known as the Palhat Gap. The Palakkad Gap functions as a terrestrial valve, a sudden, dramatic break in the mountain range, spanning approximately 24 to 30 kilometers in width. Sitting at an elevation of just 140 meters above sea level, it perfectly separates the towering Nilgiri Hills to the north from the Anaimalai Hills to the south. The origin of this gap is a story of ancient tectonic violence written into the crust of the earth. Geological evidence suggests that the Palakkad Gap is a remnant marker of continental drift, specifically the violent separation of the Indian plate from Madagascar. Over 88 million years ago, a massive underwater volcanic explosion known as the Marian Hotspot widened the breach between these diverging land masses. The ever-flowing lava continued for 2 million years, eventually creating the gap as it exists today. When the continents finally tore apart, the geological scar left behind on the Indian coast became the Palakkad Gap. This shared geological history is still evident today, supported by flora like the fly-trapping pitcher plant found both in Madagascar and in India. For millennia, this tectonic scar dictated the spatial flow of early South Indian trade. Ancient mariners faced extreme dangers if they attempted to sail south around Cape Comorin at the tip of the subcontinent. The waters there were plagued by treacherous rock formations, a lack of wind support for sailing, and ruthless pirate fleets. Consequently, merchants preferred to dock on the eastern coast and move their goods overland to the western ports. The Palakkad Gap provided the only viable overland artery for this trans-peninsular movement. Precious stones, emeralds, and glass manufactured in inland hubs like Kudumanal were transported through this pass to western ports like Muziris and Ponnani. In return, the black pepper of the Malabar coast was funneled back through the gap to the eastern Tamil dynasties of the Cholas and Pandyas. Coimbatore acted as the primary transshipment center for materials moving toward Muziris, supported by an extensive network of ancient roads called Peruvajis. Without this 30-kilometer break in the basalt wall, the deep intercultural exchange between the eastern and western coasts would have been geographically impossible. However, local overland trade was merely the first leg of the Pepper's journey. The true wealth of the Malabar coast lay across the ocean, in the booming luxury markets of the Mediterranean and the Levant. To reach these distant consumers, merchants had to conquer the Arabian Sea. They had to transition from navigating the terrestrial bottlenecks of the Ghats to mapping the invisible, shifting topography of the sky. The monsoon engine, the Hippalus winds. The Indian Ocean is governed by a massive, predictable atmospheric phenomenon. The monsoon functions as a meteorological engine, a vast seasonal exhalation of the Earth driven by the differential heating of land and water. Unlike the Atlantic or the Pacific, which are open from pole to pole, the Indian Ocean is capped to the north by the immense landmass of the Asian continent. This unique geographical arrangement generates the most powerful and reliable seasonal wind system on the planet. In the early 19th century, Alexander von Humboldt correctly identified the primary mechanism behind this system as thermal contrast. During the spring and summer, the vast Asian landmass heats up far more rapidly than the adjacent waters of the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean.
As the air over the continent warms, it expands and rises, creating a massive zone of low atmospheric pressure over the land. This ascending air creates a vacuum, actively pulling the cooler, heavier, moisture-laden air off the ocean. This process is further amplified by latent heat release, a mechanism demonstrated by James P. Espy in 1841. As oceanic moisture condenses into rain over the Indian landmass, it releases massive amounts of stored thermal energy into the atmosphere. This extra heat causes the air to rise even faster, accelerating the vacuum effect and drawing in the oceanic winds with violent, predictable force.
This immense physical process creates the southwest monsoon, a wind system so powerful it physically pushes millions of tons of seawater toward the Indian coast. Conversely, in the autumn and winter, the entire planetary process reverses itself. The Asian landmass cools down much faster than the ocean, creating a zone of high pressure over the continent. The cold, dense air sinks and rushes back out over the warmer waters of the Arabian Sea, creating the northeast monsoon. This perpetual biannual cycle of breathing in and breathing out dictated the rhythm of human life, agriculture, and commerce across the entire basin. Ancient navigators recognized this pattern long before modern meteorologists possessed the vocabulary to explain it. The Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley possessed an intimate understanding of these seasonal wind patterns over 4,000 years ago. They successfully utilized them for localized maritime exchanges, establishing the earliest known sea routes. Later, early Indian and Arab sailors mapped these invisible oceanic highways, passing down the knowledge of the winds through generations of coastal cabotage. In the Greco-Roman world, the discovery of the open ocean monsoon route is traditionally attributed to an ancient Greek mariner named Hippalus. Operating sometime in the 1st century BCE, Hippalus is credited with realizing that ships did not need to hug the dangerous, pirate-infested coastlines of Arabia and Persia. By trusting the strength and predictability of the southwest monsoon, a ship could strike out directly across the open water of the Arabian Sea and hit the Malabar coast with mathematical precision. In his honor, the Greco-Roman world frequently referred to these seasonal gales as the Hippalus winds. The Hippalus winds were the supreme catalyst of the ancient global economy. The exploitation of these winds transformed the pepper trade from a slow, coastal relay into a highly synchronized transcontinental industry. It effectively shrank the world, compressing thousands of miles of open ocean into a matter of weeks. But to utilize this meteorological engine, merchants had to submit entirely to its timing. The monsoon mechanics forced a rigid, inflexible schedule upon all maritime traffic. It dictated a mechanized schedule of shipping, forcing the Roman, Arab, and Indian fleets to operate on a strict calendar. To successfully navigate the Indian Ocean, a merchant had to structure their voyages around the following seasonal constraints. The outward journey. Summer monsoon. Ships departing from the Red Sea ports of Egypt had to set sail exactly around the month of July, which corresponded to the Egyptian month of Epiph. Waiting too long meant missing the optimal wind window. The favorable gale. By late summer, the southwest monsoon winds were blowing at their peak strength. Ships caught these tailwinds on their quarter, allowing them to bypass the deep coastal bays of Arabia entirely and strike out across the open sea. The rapid crossing. Pushed by the relentless summer gales, the crossing of the open ocean to the Indian ports of Muziris or Barigaza was remarkably fast. For those bound for Scythia or Barigaza, the final deep water crossing away from the shore lasted only 3 days before bypassing the bays. The return journey, winter monsoon. After spending the autumn anchored in Indian ports trading gold for pepper, the fleets waited for the thermal contrast to reverse. In late autumn and winter, the northeast monsoon provided the necessary tailwinds to push the heavily laden ships back across the Arabian Sea toward the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. This biannual rhythm was the heartbeat of the ancient global economy. If a ship captain missed the July departure from Egypt, he could not simply sail in August or September. He had to wait an entire year for the meteorological engine to reset itself. The winds bottlenecked the trade, concentrating massive fleets in specific ports at specific times of the year. This concentration of wealth and shipping transformed obscure coastal villages into booming, cosmopolitan megacities. Ports like Muziris on the Malabar coast became the world's first true spice emporiums, practically bursting with foreign capital. According to the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a mid-1st century Greek merchant's manual, Muziris was a bustling hub where Greek, Roman, and Arab vessels arrived loaded with gold, silver, copper, and wine. In exchange, they demanded astronomical quantities of black pepper, pearls, and ivory. The author of the Periplus remains anonymous, but internal evidence suggests he was a Greek-speaking Egyptian merchant operating out of the Red Sea. His text is written in Koine Greek and functions as a combination of atlas and traveler's handbook. It provides meticulous descriptions of the distances, directions, and local products around the Erythraean Sea, the ancient designation for the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Indian Ocean. The document's precision proves the sophistication of ancient navigation and trade logistics. The scale of this mechanized trade was staggering. Historical records indicate that during the peak of the Roman Empire, up to 120 massive merchant vessels sailed annually from the Red Sea to India. These ships were of moderate size, but their sheer numbers represented a massive investment of imperial capital. The volume of pepper moving across the ocean was so immense that it began to physically drain the Roman treasury. The Roman author Pliny the Elder famously complained about this devastating economic imbalance in his natural history. He lamented that the empire was hemorrhaging 100 million sesterces a year to India, China, and Arabia to pay for these foreign luxuries. Pliny was particularly baffled by the Roman obsession with pepper, noting that unlike sweet fruits or beautiful gems, pepper had nothing to recommend it but its pungency. He marveled that Romans would go all the way to India to get it, buying it by weight like gold or silver. Pliny carefully categorized the imported varieties, noting that long pepper was sold at 15 denarii a pound, white pepper at 7 denarii, and black pepper at 4 denarii. Yet as impressive as the open ocean crossing was, it represented only one segment of the Pepper's journey. Reaching the shores of the Red Sea did not mean the Pepper had reached the Mediterranean. The spice still had to bypass a gauntlet of terrestrial barriers, brutal deserts, and complex political borders. It had to enter the ultimate relay race of ancient commerce. The first middleman, the spatial network. Ancient global trade was rarely a direct exchange between the producer and the final consumer. It relied on vast spatial networks, a relay race of ancient commerce where goods changed hands multiple times across highly specialized geographical nodes. The black pepper of the Malabar coast was handled by Indian farmers, Arab sailors, Nabatean cameleers, Egyptian tax collectors, and Greek merchants before it ever touched the tongue of a Roman patrician. Every time the pepper changed hands, its price increased exponentially. The maritime entry point for this network was the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. This narrow waterway functions as a maritime choke point, a geographical bottleneck connecting the open expanse of the Arabian Sea to the enclosed waters of the Red Sea. Navigating this strait was notoriously dangerous due to shifting currents, hidden shoals, and the constant threat of piracy. Ships that successfully bypassed the strait still faced the arduous task of sailing hundreds of miles north against the prevailing northerly winds of the upper Red Sea. Because of these brutal headwinds, ships returning from India rarely sailed all the way to the modern-day Gulf of Suez. Instead, they unloaded their highly valuable cargo at specialized transshipment ports located hundreds of miles further south. The two most vital nodes in this Red Sea network were the ports of Myos Hormos and Berenike. These ports were strategically positioned to minimize the dangerous maritime journey and transition the cargo to overland caravans. Myos Hormos was situated further north, meaning it was a shorter overland distance to the Nile River. However, reaching it by sea required fighting the punishing northern winds for several extra days, a risk many captains refused to take. Berenike, located approximately 500 miles south of modern Suez, became the premier trade emporium for nearly 8 centuries. Founded around 275 BCE by Ptolemy II, it was geographically blessed by the Ras Banas Peninsula, which sheltered its harbour from the worst of the high northern winds. When the pepper fleets docked at Berenike, the maritime phase of the journey ended and the terrestrial phase began. Unloading the ships was a massive logistical undertaking, heavily supervised by the Roman state and subject to intense taxation. A surviving 2nd century document known as the Muziris Papyrus records a single ship's customs declaration returning to Egypt from the Malabar coast. The luxury cargo, heavily laden with pepper, was valued at a staggering 9 million sesterces, and it was immediately subjected to a devastating 25% import tax by the Roman authorities. Once taxed and processed, the pepper was loaded onto the backs of camels for the treacherous journey westward. The geography between the Red Sea coast and the Nile River is dominated by the eastern desert. This environment is a brutal, hyper-arid wasteland that historically repelled human habitation and defied easy crossing. To cross this wasteland, the Romans engineered a highly sophisticated infrastructure system to keep the spatial network functioning. This infrastructure relied entirely on hydriamata. A hydrium acts as a vascular system for trade, a fortified man-made watering station built directly into the desert rock. These stations were constructed with massive cisterns, deep wells, and high protective walls, spaced out at regular intervals along the caravan routes. They provided physical respite for the camels and drivers, but they also functioned as an internal military limes, deterring desert bandits like the Blemmyes from disrupting the lucrative flow of spices. The caravan journey from Berenike to the Nile Emporium of Koptos spanned approximately 370 kilometers. It required 12 days of grueling desert travel, moving from one fortified hydriama to the next. The journey from the northern port of Myos Hormos to Koptos was shorter, taking roughly 7 days, but required crossing equally unforgiving terrain. The cameleers typically traveled at night, using the stars for navigation to avoid the lethal daytime heat of the Egyptian sun. Upon reaching Koptos, the environment abruptly shifted from barren desert to the lush green ribbon of the Nile Valley. Here, the pepper was unloaded from the camels and transferred onto shallow river barges. The cargo then floated roughly 760 kilometers down the Nile, a journey of approximately 11 or 12 days. it finally reached the Mediterranean megacity of Alexandria, the undisputed commercial capital of the Roman East. Alexandria acted as the grand clearinghouse for the ancient world. It was the final eastern node, where Venetian, Greek, and Roman merchants fought for access to the black gold pouring out of the desert. From Alexandria, the pepper was loaded onto Mediterranean galleys and shipped across the sea to the port of Ostia, the maritime gateway to Rome. Depending on the weather and the season, this final maritime sprint could take anywhere from 20 to 26 days, assuming a sailing speed of roughly 100 kilometers per day. Only then, after crossing jungles, oceans, deserts, rivers, and seas, did the pepper finally reach the imperial capital. However, the Roman-Egyptian route was not the only spatial network moving pepper to the west. A parallel, entirely overland alternative existed further north, controlled by the desert tribes of the Levant. Before the discovery of the Hippalus winds allowed Greco-Roman ships to sail directly to India, Arabian and Nabatean middlemen held a virtual monopoly on the movement of eastern luxuries. This northern spatial network bypassed the Red Sea entirely, relying instead on the Persian Gulf. Indian ships would sail into the Gulf and unload their pepper at ancient ports near the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. From there, the goods had to cross over 1,400 kilometers of the Syrian desert to reach the Mediterranean. This required immense caravans numbering in the thousands of camels, organized by the semi-nomadic tribes of the region. The desert cities of Petra and Palmyra flourished as the indispensable middlemen of this overland route. Palmyra, standing isolated in the middle of the desolate Tadmorian desert, utilized its neutral, semi-independent status to act as a bridge between the rival Roman and Parthian empires. Surrounded by natural barriers and basalt flats, Palmyra provided the only reliable water sources for caravans moving westward toward the Mediterranean coast. The city profited immensely simply by providing a safe harbor in an ocean of sand. Further south, the Nabatean city of Petra acted as the central hub for goods moving up from the Arabian Peninsula. The Nabateans mastered the art of hydraulic engineering, carving hidden cisterns into the desert canyons to support the massive camel trains. These routes collectively served as channels for the trading of Arabian frankincense, Indian spices, and precious stones moving toward the Levantine port of Gaza. These cities grew unfathomably rich simply by existing at the critical intersection of geography and human desire. They taxed the pepper, stored the pepper, and protected the pepper, functioning as the vital connective tissue between the East and the West. Whether the pepper flowed up the Red Sea to Alexandria or across the Syrian desert to Palmyra and Gaza, the physical toll of moving it was staggering. The sheer number of hands it passed through guaranteed that its final price in the markets of Europe was astronomical. The pepper trade was a compounding mechanism of wealth creation, enriching every middleman along the route. During periods of political crisis, this astronomical value was laid bare for all to see. Pepper was literally weighed against its equivalent in gold, serving as a hard currency when silver and bronze failed. In 408 CE, when Alaric the Visigoth besieged Rome, he demanded a ransom to spare the starving citizens. Alongside 2,500 kilograms of gold and 4,000 silk dresses, the barbarian king demanded exactly 3,000 pounds of black pepper. The spice had transcended its botanical origins. It was the ultimate symbol of imperial wealth. The history of early global trade is not merely a record of human economics. It is a testament to the inescapable power of physical geography. The mountains, the winds, and the deserts were not passive landscapes. They were active forces that dictated the wealth of nations and the rise and fall of empires. The pursuit of pepper forced humanity to map the globe. The basalt walls of the Western Ghats forced the creation of specialized overland corridors, elevating the Palakkad Gap into a vital artery of intercultural exchange. The vast thermal engine of the Asian landmass generated the monsoon winds, providing a mechanized, biannual power source that pulled humanity across the open ocean. The brutal aridness of the eastern desert necessitated the creation of the Hydriamata, forging a terrestrial chain of survival that linked the Red Sea to the Nile. Geography was the ultimate arbiter of commerce. Black pepper, a small, unassuming vine native to the Malabar jungle, became the catalyst for overcoming these geographic constraints. In the pursuit of this tiny, pungent berry, ancient mariners learned to read the atmospheric pressure of the globe, and desert nomads learned to engineer water out of dry rock. The spatial networks they built spanning from the backwaters of Kerala to the wharves of Ostia, laid the permanent foundations for a globally connected world. Ultimately, the story of Pepper is the story of humanity's stubborn, relentless refusal to be contained by the earth.